The great 19th century Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard once stated that life can be understood backwards, but it can only be lived forwards. Now that's a little convoluted, so let me say it again. Life can only be understood backwards, but it can only be lived forwards. Another way to say this is that how we live life going forward is very much dependent on what we have learned by looking backwards. Or as another writer once said, those who can't remember the past are doomed to repeat it. On July 4th, 1776, the Second Continental Congress of the 13 United States of America issued a document which they called the Declaration of Independence, which said in part, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." A little piece of historic trivia associated with the Declaration of Independence is that roughly half the signers of the Declaration of Independence were of the Church of England. They were Episcopalians. Historically, the belief that there is but one law for all of mankind, granted by our Creator, is the belief of what is called natural law. Now, whether you believe mankind was created a few thousand years ago, or whether mankind appeared hundreds of thousands of years ago, one aspect of mankind is universally true. And that is, only man, among all the animals of the kingdom, is a spiritual being. What that means is that only man looks beyond himself for guidance on understanding his existence and for guidance on living his life. This inner drive of man to look beyond himself was beautifully described by the 20th century English mystic Evelyn Underhill in her 1936 book titled Worship. And in her book, Underhill wrote this about spirituality and religious action. When we consider how unnecessary religious action is to man's physical well-being, how frequently indeed its demands run counter to his material advantage, yet how irresistible is its attraction for awakened souls, we can hardly doubt that here in this mysterious intercourse, which we know from the human side as worship, there is disclosed to us a deep purpose of the eternal will, and a path is opened along which our conditioned spirits can move out towards the absolute life. Well, we might ask, is it absolutely necessary that we pay attention to this spiritual calling in our lives? Or is it more akin to something like being bored, where we can decide when and where and how to respond to the urge, or whether we'll respond at all? Well, we can probably say that our personal understanding of the importance of our spiritual calling comes from looking backwards in our own lives. By looking back, we often find that there are some disturbing limitations in our past. For example, we often discover that reason, what's inside our brain, reason can't explain why there is reason. And science, all around us, cannot explain why there is science. And that while reason and science can tell us a lot about how the universe works, they can't explain why we're here or what our purpose in the great cosmos is. And so with that, if we cannot define a purpose for our existence, then we're confronted with this horrible, horrible proposition of human life. And that proposition is, why should we put up with all the drudgery and all the heartache and all the suffering of human existence if there is no other purpose beyond simple daily existence? And so it was from this fundamental thirst for that purpose, my purpose, your purpose, that mankind opened itself spiritually to the apprehension of God and God's calling in our lives. In today's reading from Deuteronomy, we see Moses summarizing what God has done for the Hebrews. The Hebrews have come to the Jordan River, around the area called Moab, and Moses is turning over the mantle of leadership to Joshua, as God has ordained. And in the reading, Moses is forcing the Hebrews to stop and look backwards to see what the implications of God's actions have been for their faith and for their life going forwards. And he tells them in verse 9, don't forget these things your eyes have seen. Teach them to your children and their children after them. Well, with this reading from Deuteronomy, we now have several concepts which come together with a particular meaning for us who live in these interesting times. First, we have the concept that the direction and value of life going forward is very much influenced by remembering our past. Secondly, the seminal founding document of this country, Declaration of Independence, stated as an immutable article of faith that all men were created equal under the natural law of God. And it stated that this particular form of grace, equality, should be available to all mankind. And third, the earliest patriarchs of the Old Testament exhorted the people of God to remember the faithfulness of God towards mankind, so that our life going forward for all generations would benefit from that remembrance. And so for those of us sitting here today in America, Kierkegaard's wisdom of looking back is so very critical to our future going forward. Let us look for a moment at a very high-level view of the history of the world in the context of mankind. When you look at the world's history that way, what you note is that with very few exceptions, the history of mankind is pretty grim. It is a history of despotic kings, of dictators, of continual violence against the powerless, of prisons, dungeons, torture, and gross inhumanity. In other words, the history of mankind is a history which is permeated, riddled, and seemingly controlled by evil.